Professor Dela Cruz, standing tall at the front, cast a glance over her students with an air of unshakable authority. "Today's riddle," she declared, her voice cold and unyielding, "has crushed even the brightest minds. If you're not quick, if you're not sharp, prepare to fail, solve it, or be exposed for what you really are." The equation appeared, a monstrous tangle of calculus, algebra, and geometry, its complexity daring anyone to step forward. The room went still. Every student's heart raced as they stared at the problem, their minds spinning with frustration, their pens trembling in their hands. No one expected it to be solved, but there at the back of the class sat Elena, quiet, overlooked, the girl no one thought would even try. Yet as her classmates scrambled in confusion, her eyes locked onto the equation with a clarity they could never hope to achieve. In a matter of seconds, she began to write, her chalk moving with precision, carving through the problem like a surgeon cutting through tissue. No one had seen it coming. As the rest of the class faltered, Elena's hand moved with confidence, her mind faster than anyone could keep up with, what they thought was impossible. She knew exactly how to fix it. All eyes were on the professor. She was known for her merciless nature, for challenging even the brightest minds. If you couldn't solve her problems, you didn't belong in her class. This was no mere riddle. It was a test of endurance, a trial that could decide whether a student was worthy of her respect. Those who failed weren't just embarrassed. They were publicly humiliated. In the front row, a few of the top students exchanged glances, silently sizing up the problem, already mentally preparing their strategies. Their hands moved, but their minds were elsewhere. They were confident, almost too confident. After all, this was Professor Dela Cruz, the same woman who had dismissed dozens of students for their lack of ability. They knew the routine: fail, disappear. Elena, however, was sitting in the back of the room, her hands folded neatly on her desk, her notebook open but untouched. Her gaze was fixed on the equation, but not with the same frantic energy as the others. She wasn't scribbling notes, desperately trying to keep up. No, Elena was studying the problem with a quiet intensity, her eyes moving across the symbols with an almost eerie calm. Her friend Mia, sitting next to her, couldn't resist breaking the tension. She leaned over and whispered, her voice light and teasing, "I bet you the answer is impossible," her smirk widening as she added, "Like everything else in this class, right?" Elena's lips twitched into the smallest of smiles, a fleeting moment of relief in an otherwise oppressive atmosphere. Mia's humor always had a way of cutting through the most intense situations. Elena couldn't help but laugh softly, a sound so quiet it barely escaped her lips. Mia's joke, though light-hearted, hit a chord in the room. The surrounding students glanced at each other, unsure whether to laugh or stay serious. But the professor's cold, sharp gaze didn't shift. She was unmoved by the laughter, her eyes never straying from the equation she had written. In a matter of seconds, the class went silent once more, as if the words themselves had frozen time. Elena, a quiet Filipino girl in the middle of the classroom, surrounded by whispers and hushed voices. Her dark brown eyes are focused on the blackboard, her mind processing the equation like a chess master, calculating multiple moves ahead. Eleanor's presence was easy to overlook. She didn't call attention to herself. She rarely spoke in class, and kept to herself outside of it, always in the shadows, never in the spotlight. A girl who was too quiet, too reserved for anyone to notice her brilliance. But Elena knew her worth. Despite her reserved nature, she had always been gifted with numbers. In a world where many saw her as invisible, math was the one language that never judged her, never questioned her abilities. The camera lingers on her face, the weight of expectation pushing down on her shoulders. She's not like the others, not like the confident students in the front row who, while smart, didn't see the problem with the same depth. To them, it was just another equation to conquer. For Elena, it was personal. Every test, every riddle, was another opportunity to prove herself to those who never thought she would make it this far. But there was something more at play here than just a simple equation. Eleanor's heart raced, not from fear, but from the Realization that there was something off about the problem, something others hadn't noticed, a small detail that to most would be dismissed as insignificant. But to Elena, it was a glaring mistake. Her fingers twitched slightly as her mind began to work faster than her body could keep up. Her heart drummed in her chest, but her hands remained still. She couldn't speak. She couldn't draw attention to herself. Not in this classroom, not with this professor, not with all the eyes of her classmates and the visiting faculty members watching her every move. Her mind raced as the professor continued her lecture, speaking in her usual controlled manner. Dela Cruz was confident, too confident. Elena could hear the low murmurs of the students behind her, the quiet whispers of doubt. They weren't afraid of the professor, but they were afraid of failure, afraid of being the one who couldn't keep up. Elena was different. She wasn't afraid of failing the professor, but speaking up, that was a different story. Her thoughts clouded for a moment. What if she was wrong? What if the mistake was just a trick of the mind? There was no way to know for sure without saying something, and once she said something, there was no going back. Elena didn't know if she was ready to challenge the professor, especially not in front of everyone. The tension in the room felt palpable, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Elena glanced at Mia, who was watching her with curiosity. Though she too had noticed the flaw in the equation, Mia gave her a look, one of quiet encouragement, but it was enough. It was the smallest gesture, the faintest smile, but it was enough to push Elena toward the precipice. She raised her hand, slowly but decisively. The classroom held its breath. Professor Dela Cruz stopped talking. The silence was deafening. Her eyes flicked toward Elena, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. It wasn't anger that Elena saw in her gaze, not yet. It was something colder, something calculating. "Do you have something to add, Miss Elena?" Dela Cruz's voice cut through the stillness like a knife. Her tone was laced with sarcasm, as if she were mocking Elena before she even spoke. The classroom was still. All eyes were now on Elena, and she could feel every single one of them. The pressure was suffocating. Her breath caught in her throat as she hesitated for a brief second, but this time she couldn't stay silent. "I think there's a mistake in the equation," Elena said, her voice soft but clear, the words feeling like they weighed 1,000 pounds. The room froze. Every eye was on her now. Dela Cruz narrowed her eyes, not in anger but in silent disbelief. "A mistake, you say?" Elena nodded, her palms now clammy against the desk. She had done it. She had broken the silence. But the real question was, what would happen next? The classroom was always cold. Not because of the air conditioning or the dreary, fluorescent lights overhead, but because of the distance Elena felt from everyone around her. She was used to being invisible. Sitting at the back of the classroom, her notebook always neatly aligned, her pen poised in a way that made it clear she was ready but not eager to be noticed. She was a shadow in a room full of bright lights. Elena didn't mind. She had always preferred it that way. Born into a modest Filipino family, Elena had learned early on that nothing in life was handed to you on a silver platter. She didn't come from wealth, didn't have connections, and certainly wasn't the kind of student who had professors and classmates rallying behind her. Her classmates all had stories about their summer internships at top tech companies or their private tutors, while Elena's stories were simple, like how her mom used to make the best adobo, or how she spent her weekends helping her father fix. And things around the house, simple, humble, inconspicuous. But her mind was different. Elena had an uncanny ability to solve problems. Math was her world, a world where numbers, equations, and theories didn't judge her for the way she spoke or looked. To her, math was a constant, a language that didn't care about her background or her accent. It only cared about precision, logic, and understanding. In her mind, numbers weren't just symbols. They were beautiful, orderly, perfect. Yet despite this brilliance, Elena struggled to be seen. Her classmates often overlooked her, mistaking her quietness for ignorance. They didn't understand that Elena's mind moved too fast for them to keep up. When the professor would present a problem on the board, most students would furiously scribble down notes, trying to follow along. But Elena, she didn't need to write it all down. Her mind had already solved the problem in seconds, but no one knew that. Elena wasn't one to boast, to draw attention to herself. She stayed silent, allowed others to get the credit even when she knew she could do better. It wasn't that she wanted to hide her ability, it was that she was terrified of being noticed. Not because she was afraid of being praised, but because she feared being misunderstood. She feared the professors who would look at her and think, how did she get here? Elena knew the whispers that followed her when she entered a room. She didn't fit the stereotype of a math genius. She wasn't the confident, flashy student that professors expected to shine. She was the quiet, reserved girl, always in the background. And Elena was okay with that for a while. But today was different. Today she couldn't stay quiet. Elena's gaze flicked briefly toward the front of the room, where Professor Dela Cruz stood at the chalkboard, poised and unshakable, as usual. Elena's heart thudded. She knew this class. She knew the rigor of Professor Dela Cruz's challenges, but this time she felt something stir within her, a quiet rebellion against the self-imposed silence. She had to speak up. She had to prove that she belonged, even if the professor and the entire class didn't see her that way. Elena's insecurities ran deep, and they weren't just about math or the academic world. They were about who she was, what she could be, and why others didn't see her for what she truly was. Every day she felt as though she were hiding her potential, her intellect, her voice. And when she did speak up, it was always in the safest way possible, never daring to challenge authority. Elena wasn't used to fighting for herself. It wasn't just that the professors never acknowledged her brilliance. It was that she had grown used to it. People didn't expect much from a girl like her. She wasn't a child prodigy. She wasn't raised in a family of mathematicians, and she wasn't the type to seek out the spotlight. Her classmates, who came from well-off families with their fancy gadgets and private tutors, often made snide remarks. They assumed she was here because of a scholarship, because of her background, rather than any real ability. But those comments didn't hurt as much as the silence. It was the silence from the professors that wounded her, the unspoken judgment in their eyes, the way they expected her to fail because she didn't fit the mold of a successful student. And though they never said it outright, she knew they looked at her and thought, she doesn't belong here. She had tried to ignore it. She told herself it didn't matter. But deep down, Elena feared they were right, that she didn't belong in this world of academia, that like so many before her, she would eventually fall behind, a casualty of a system that didn't have room for students like her. But even through that fear, there was a spark, a whisper inside her mind that said, maybe you can prove them wrong. Today was the day she would stop hiding. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp voice of Professor Dela Cruz, who stood poised at the front of the room, turning to face the class. Elena swallowed, bracing herself. She had no choice now but to face the test, to face Dela Cruz. Professor Dela Cruz had always been the embodiment of authority in the classroom. Tall and commanding, her presence made everyone sit up straighter, take notes more carefully, and hold their breath a little longer. Her cold demeanor was legendary, and it was her students' worst nightmare. But it was also why she was respected, because she didn't tolerate weakness. Dela Cruz had built her reputation on a simple principle: the weak don't belong. She eliminated those who couldn't keep up, discarding them like yesterday's homework. It wasn't just about teaching, it was about proving herself to be superior, proving that only those with true intellect would survive her classroom. She didn't coddle students. She didn't entertain mistakes. If you couldn't handle the pressure, then you didn't deserve to be in her class. And Elena knew all too well that she was at risk. Dela Cruz had looked at her once or twice, her gaze cold and calculating, as though she was already dismissing Elena as someone who would never be able to keep up. The professor's harsh words from previous lectures still echoed in Elena's ears. You're too quiet, too passive. Do you even understand the material, or are you just pretending? It wasn't that Dela Cruz hated Elena. No, it was far worse than that. Dela Cruz simply didn't see her. She didn't acknowledge her potential, her intelligence, because Elena didn't fit the image of the ideal student. Elena had spent the entire semester trying to prove she could do the work, trying to show that she deserved to be there, but every step forward was met with silent doubt. Now, Elena's internal conflict was reaching a boiling point. The same professor who had dismissed her, who had laughed at her in front of the class, was about to challenge her. The same professor who had made her feel small was now presenting an impossible problem. Elena knew that if she spoke up, it would be a challenge, more than just an academic one. It would be a challenge to the system, a challenge to the assumptions that had been made about her from the start. And that terrified her. Her heart raced as she glanced toward the front of the room. Professor Dela Cruz stood with her back to the class, writing complex equations on the board. She was waiting for someone to step up to give an answer, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. No one spoke. No one dared to. Elena knew that if she raised her hand now, if she spoke, all eyes would be on her. And for the first time in her life, Elena realized that it didn't matter what they thought anymore. What mattered was that she was willing to stand up, willing to say, "I belong here." But the voice inside her, the one that had stayed silent for so long, was afraid. What if she was wrong? What if in front of the entire class she failed? Elena closed her eyes for a second, gathering her courage. There was a tiny flicker of hope in her heart, a tiny spark that whispered, "You're not invisible, not today." The seconds stretched into minutes, each one feeling longer than the last, as Elena sat at the back of the room, her eyes glued to the board. The problem before her seemed insurmountable. Professor Dela Cruz had asked the class to solve an equation that twisted and turned in ways no simple approach could handle. Elena's classmates were scribbling furiously, their faces strained with concentration. But as the minutes passed, Elena's fingers remained still on the paper, her mind working at lightning speed, trying to untangle the problem before her. The equation was complex, no doubt. It was everything the professor had promised, an ultimate test of their abilities. But as Elena stared at the symbols, something began to shift in her mind. The more she analyzed, the more she saw that there was something wrong with the equation. A flaw, a mistake, small but critical. Professor Dela Cruz hadn't noticed it, but Elena, with her sharp mind and attention to detail, had caught it in an instant. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what it meant. If the equation was flawed, it couldn't be solved. It was impossible. The entire challenge that had the class on edge, the riddle that had seemed like an impenetrable wall, was a trick. It was an illusion, a carefully constructed puzzle built on a false premise. The realization was both a relief and a source of intense anxiety. Elena could feel the weight of her discovery, but with it came the crushing pressure to act. What would happen if she pointed out the mistake? Would the professor humiliate her for speaking up? Would the class turn against her? Elena's heart hammered in her chest as she continued to work through the problem, her mind cycling through the possible outcomes. She could stay silent, let the class continue their futile attempts at solving the impossible equation. After all, no one would notice her absence. No one would pay attention to her lack of effort. She could blend back into the background, a quiet observer as always. It was easier that way. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she couldn't just sit back. This wasn't about avoiding attention anymore. It was about proving that she belonged, proving that she was just as capable as the student sitting at the front of the room. She had come too far, worked too hard to be pushed aside again. The thoughts collided in her mind, and she could feel the internal struggle mounting. What if she was wrong? What if the equation wasn't flawed at all, and she made a fool of herself? The fear of failure gripped her like a vice. What if Professor Dela Cruz dismissed her? What if the entire class laughed at her? But there was something else growing inside her, something stronger than the fear. A flicker of defiance, a whisper inside her that told her she couldn't keep letting the world pass her by. This was her moment. If she didn't take it, if she stayed quiet now, she might never have the courage to speak up again. The seconds felt like hours as she weighed her options. The classroom was silent except for the scratching of pencils and the soft hum of the air conditioning. Elena's pulse raced in her ears, drowning out all other sounds. Her hand trembled slightly on the desk, and for a moment she thought she might just leave the problem unsolved. But then, like a spark igniting a fire, Elena knew she had to act. She couldn't let this moment slip away. Elena raised her hand slowly, her heart thudding in her chest. She didn't expect anyone to notice at first, but the eyes of her classmates immediately shifted to her, the buzz of whispers cutting off as if everyone had been holding their breath. The professor paused mid-sentence, her gaze moving from the board to Elena, a thin eyebrow raising in suspicion. There was a brief silence before the professor's voice, smooth but sharp, filled the room. "Do you have something to add, Miss Elena?" Dela Cruz asked, her tone measured, almost bored. Elena's stomach churned as she stood up. Her voice was tight, shaky, as she said, "Professor, I think there's a mistake in the equation." The room seemed to freeze. Elena could feel all eyes on her, heavy, scrutinizing eyes, and the moment stretched into an unbearable silence. The hum of the air conditioning was the only sound in the room, and even that seemed to fade as the tension thickened. Professor Dela Cruz didn't speak right away. Instead, she turned to face the board again, her eyes scanning the problem, her lips pressed into a thin line. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Did the professor see it? Had Elena miscalculated, or was the professor simply ignoring her, ready to dismiss her once again? Finally, Dela Cruz's eyes narrowed, her face a mask of controlled irritation. She turned slowly to face Elena, her gaze hard as steel. "Are you sure, Miss Elena?" the professor asked, her voice dripping with disdain. "You've checked the math? You're certain there's a mistake?" The entire classroom seemed to hold its breath as Elena stood there, feeling the weight of the professor's gaze on her. The students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and Elena could hear the barely contained murmurs of doubt echoing around the room. "Of course, you understand," Dela Cruz continued, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, "that this isn't some simple addition or subtraction, right? This is an advanced problem, one that requires a sharp mind to solve. Are you sure you've understood the problem correctly? Perhaps you missed something." Elena's chest tightened as the professor's words sank in. It was clear what Dela Cruz was doing. She was questioning her ability, undermining her claim, making her second-guess herself. But Elena stood firm, her eyes locking with the professor's. "I'm sure," Elena said quietly, but with more conviction than she had ever shown in her life. "I've gone over it several times, and there's a flaw in the equation." For a brief moment, the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. The students exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to make of the situation. Dela Cruz stood still, her face betraying nothing but cold professionalism. The weight of her silent judgment pressed down on Elena's shoulders like a stone, threatening to crush her resolve. Elena's hands were clammy, but her mind was clear. She had to finish this. There was no turning back now. Professor Dela Cruz, ever the skeptic, turned back to the board, her hands resting at her sides. She examined the equation once more, this time with a more deliberate slowness, as if weighing every element of it. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. The room felt too quiet. The tension was unbearable. Finally, Dela Cruz sighed, her shoulders stiffening as she glanced back at Elena. "Fine," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Prove it. Come to the front and show us where the mistake is, Miss Elena. If you can, of course." The moment hung in the air. All eyes were on Elena now, and she could feel the gaze of every single student in the room, some skeptical, some curious, but all waiting for her to either succeed or fail. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. Elena stood, her legs Feeling unsteady, but her resolve was firm. She walked to the front of the room slowly, trying to calm her racing heart. The class followed her with their eyes, some looking on with disbelief, others with anticipation. The chalk felt heavier than usual in her hand as she approached the board, her mind already racing through the steps she would need to take. She had no time to waste. There was no room for error. But as she took her position at the front of the class, Eleanor knew one thing for sure. She was ready to face whatever came next. The classroom seemed to grow colder as Elena walked toward the front. Each step echoed, the sound amplified by the silence in the room. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was almost certain the entire class could hear it. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, each one scrutinizing, judging. The professor's gaze was like a weight on her back, heavy and unyielding. Professor Dela Cruz, with her arms crossed tightly across her chest, stared down at Elena with an expression that was a mixture of irritation and disbelief. "Well, miss Elena," she said with a calm yet biting tone, "let's see if you can back up your words. Come up here and show us where this supposed mistake is." Her voice had a sharp edge to it, like a challenge that Elena couldn't turn down. The professor's cold demeanor didn't show the embarrassment that Elena could feel lingering beneath the surface. She was trying to hold her ground, but Elena could see through it. Dela Cruz was rattled. The professor, usually so unshakable, had been put in a position where she had no choice but to defend her own authority. The class was quiet, their breaths held as they waited for Elena to make her move. The tension in the room was so thick it felt suffocating. Every student, every professor's assistant in the room was watching this confrontation unfold. Elena could feel the weight of their expectations, some of them eager for her to fail, some hoping for her to succeed. As Elena reached the front, the air seemed to grow heavier. She could almost feel the energy in the room shift, as if the entire class was holding its breath. She stood before the board, her chalk trembling in her fingers, but her resolve was steady. She wasn't going to back down. As Elena positioned herself in front of the board, ready to solve the equation, a voice from the back of the room broke the heavy silence. Kevin, her classmate, leaned over to Mia with a grin on his face, his voice low but just loud enough for a few people around him to hear. "Here comes the new math superhero. Watch out, Dela Cruz." The moment was brief, but the humor was enough to release some of the pressure in the room. A few students chuckled nervously, their eyes darting from Kevin's mischievous grin to Elena, who stood at the front, poised to challenge the professor. Even Elena felt a small, almost imperceptible laugh bubble up inside her. It was a moment of levity in the midst of an incredibly high-stakes situation. Kevin's comment, playful as it was, seemed to catch Dela Cruz off guard. Her sharp eyes flashed toward the back of the room, her expression hardening. But Eleanor didn't let the professor's shift in attention faze her. She took a deep breath and focused. The room fell silent again, and the weight of the moment returned. With full force, Elena's pulse raced in her ears as she stared at the equation on the board. She had seen it. She knew exactly where the flaw was. But now, as she stood in front of everyone, with Dela Cruz's scrutinizing gaze locked on her, Elena's nerves almost got the best of her. She could feel the judgment of her peers, their eyes boring into her back like they were all silently betting on her failure. The whispers started again, soft at first, then growing louder. "She won't get it right," someone muttered. "What if she can't fix it?" The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow, but she didn't let them stop her. She had come this far. She wasn't about to let their doubt make her doubt herself. Her hands, though trembling slightly, moved confidently to the board. The chalk felt solid in her grasp, as though it had been an extension of herself. She drew a line under the part of the equation that was wrong, pausing for just a moment to steady herself. Every eye in the room was on her, waiting. With a sharp, deliberate motion, Elena rewrote the equation, fixing the mistake the professor had missed. It wasn't just about solving the equation, it was about making a statement. This was her moment, and she was going to own it. She drew the correction with precision, each symbol falling into place as if it had always belonged there. Elena's hand moved with a quiet confidence that surprised even herself. Her years of quietly studying, of solving equations in her room, alone, had prepared her for this moment. And as the last piece of the correction fell into place, she stepped back, taking a deep breath. The room remained eerily silent. Elena turned to face the class, her heart racing. The professor had not said a word, but the tension in the room was palpable. The class waited for Dela Cruz's reaction. Professor Dela Cruz, who had once been the epitome of control, stood still, her arms still crossed in front of her chest. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the board, her sharp gaze dissecting every inch of the equation. Elena could feel her professor's presence, could sense the calculating look in her eyes. Dela Cruz wasn't used to being challenged. Not like this, not by someone she had dismissed from the start. She was supposed to be the one who had all the answers. This wasn't part of the script. After what felt like an eternity, Dela Cruz finally spoke, her voice strained but still authoritative. "Well, I suppose there's no room for debate there." Her words were clipped, barely masking her displeasure. "You've corrected the equation." Elena stood still, feeling the weight of the professor's reluctant acknowledgement. She wanted to smile, wanted to celebrate the fact that she had proven herself, but she couldn't. Dela Cruz had yet to concede fully. But then, the unexpected happened. Dela Cruz, her voice dripping with thinly veiled contempt, tried to take back control of the situation. She cleared her throat and began to speak again, her tone still cold, but trying to sound composed. "However," she began, her eyes narrowing, "let's not be too hasty. This could be a fluke. Perhaps, Miss Elena, you've simply found one mistake. But can you handle a deeper challenge?" Her attempt to dismiss Elena's success in front of the class was transparent, but it was still chilling to hear. The professor, though clearly rattled, wasn't ready to accept defeat. She was fighting to maintain her authority, but it was too late. The students were already whispering among themselves. They had seen it. Elena had not only corrected the equation, but had done so with an ease and clarity that left no room for doubt. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. The students who had once doubted her now looked at her with a mixture of surprise and admiration. Whispers began to grow louder, not of skepticism, but of respect. Elena had caught them all by surprise. The cold, impassable walls of the classroom atmosphere began to crack. Elena had done it. She had overcome the impossible, not just by solving the equation, but by facing the entire room, standing tall against a professor who had once written her off. And now, Dela Cruz had no choice but to confront the fact that she had just been outsmarted by a student she had barely noticed. The students started to murmur among themselves, their voices soft at first, but quickly growing in volume. "Did she really just solve that?" one of them whispered. "I didn't think anyone could," another added. There was no doubt now. Elena had proven herself in a way that no one had expected. Professor Dela Cruz stood in silence for a long moment, her face tight with frustration. She had no retort, no way to deflect the truth that Elena had just exposed. The equation, which had once seemed so insurmountable, had been unraveled with a single stroke of the chalk. And Elena had done it without hesitation. The class was no longer just watching. They were now witnesses to a moment of history. A student who had been overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated had just shown them all what true brilliance looked. Like Dela Cruz, still struggling to regain her composure, gave one final dismissive glance at Elena before turning away. "Well, I suppose you're not completely useless after all," she muttered under her breath, though no one in the room missed the bitterness laced in her words. Elena, her heart still racing, took a deep breath. This was her victory. For a moment, the room remained in stunned silence. The tension was palpable, suffocating, as Professor Dela Cruz stood at the front of the class, her back stiff, her arms still crossed over her chest. Elena's correction on the board had left her speechless, but Dela Cruz wasn't about to let this moment slip away. She had been humiliated. Her authority had been questioned in front of the entire class. She couldn't let Elena's quiet victory stand uncontested after what felt like an eternity. De la Cruz finally broke the silence with a thin, tight smile. "Well, Miss Elena," she said, her voice clipped but still filled with the same air of superiority, "I see that you have solved that one. Congratulations. But I'm afraid your triumph is short-lived." Elena could see the flicker of frustration in De la Cruz's eyes, an almost imperceptible crack in the professor's calm exterior. It was clear that De la Cruz had no intention of acknowledging defeat. Her ego, bruised and battered, demanded retribution. "If you're so sure of your abilities," De la Cruz continued, her voice now dripping with challenge, "then solve this." She quickly scribbled another equation on the board. The problem was far more complicated than the previous one, an intricate mess of calculus, algebra, and geometry, designed specifically to break any student who dared to challenge the professor. This was a test of endurance, a test designed to crush any student who thought they could take her on. The class gasped softly, sensing the high stakes in the room. Elena felt the weight of the moment press down on her, but it didn't intimidate her. This was what she had been waiting for. Without a moment's hesitation, Elena stood tall and walked to the front of the classroom. Her steps were deliberate, calm, like a professional walking into a high-stakes game. The eyes of the class followed her every move. She didn't glance at De la Cruz, didn't falter in her resolve. Elena was no longer the shy, quiet girl hiding in the back of the room. She was in control. The atmosphere in the room had shifted again. There was no longer any doubt about Elena's abilities, but the tension had escalated. This was the final test. The equation that De la Cruz had written on the board was nothing short of a beast. It was an impossibly difficult problem, one that only the brightest minds would be able to solve, and even then it would take time, perhaps too much time. But Elena didn't hesitate. She took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment of focus. Her hand gripped the chalk, and without another glance at the class, she began. The sound of chalk against the board was the only noise in the room, punctuating the deep silence that surrounded them. The students in the class couldn't take their eyes off her. Elena moved quickly, her chalk creating a flurry of numbers and symbols as she broke the equation down, solving it with methodical precision. The students who had doubted her earlier now leaned forward, their eyes wide with disbelief. This wasn't possible. Some of them exchanged glances. Was she really solving it? Did she know something they didn't? The answer was clear in their faces. Elena was doing what no one else could do. She was solving the impossible problem as if it were a simple equation. Her hand moved swiftly, almost effortlessly, as though the problem didn't challenge her at all. A few students even whispered, their voices barely audible. "Is she really going to finish it?" The professor, still standing in the back of the room, watched Elena's every movement, her face still impassive, but now with a faint trace of concern in her eyes. She couldn't let this happen, but Elena's hands never faltered. She was in her element now, her mind racing through the complex. Steps. She had the answer. She could see it as clear as day. Her body moved with confidence, and the chalk never slowed. Her thoughts were sharp, cutting through the problem as if it was already solved in her mind. As Elena reached the final line of the equation, the room seemed to hold its breath. Her hand paused for just a moment before she wrote the last symbol. Completing the equation, the room fell silent. The sound of chalk hitting the board was the only noise that broke the stillness. Elena stood back, her hands slowly dropping to her side as she looked at the equation she had just solved. The equation that no one else in the room had been able to even come close to solving. For a long moment, no one spoke, no one moved. De la Cruz stood frozen. Her eyes scanned the board, her lips pressed into a thin line. She blinked once, then twice, her gaze flickering over the problem again, as if expecting the numbers to change, expecting Elena to have missed something. But there was no mistake. The solution was flawless, and De la Cruz knew it. A shiver ran through the room. The air seemed to grow thicker, heavier. The students, once skeptical, now looked at Elena with a newfound awe. The realization hit them all at once. Elena had done it. She had just solved the equation, and Dela Cruz couldn't deny it. The professor's face hardened, her calm demeanor slipping as she took a deep breath. The truth was undeniable. Elena had turned the tables. The student who had been invisible, underestimated, had just outclassed her, solving a problem that not even the most brilliant students could crack. Dela Cruz opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was speechless, unable to accept the truth that was now so clear to everyone in the room. Elena didn't wait for the professor's acknowledgement, nor did she seek praise from her classmates. She had already proven herself, as the silence stretched on. Elena quietly stepped away from the board and returned to her seat at the back of the room. Her heart was still racing, her mind still buzzing with the adrenaline of the moment, but she didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her victory was quiet, internal. She had proven to herself more than anyone else that she was worthy, that she belonged. As Elena sat down, she could feel the weight of her classmates' gazes on her. There was no longer any doubt. The students who had once dismissed her were now looking at her with respect, some even with admiration. Elena sat back in her chair, her hands resting on the desk, as the room began to murmur once more. The buzz of conversation slowly grew, but Elena wasn't part of it. She didn't need to be. She had done what she set out to do. She had changed the way everyone saw her. The room was still buzzing when Dela Cruz finally spoke, her voice as cold and controlled as before. "Well," she said almost too calmly, "it seems I was mistaken." Her words were clipped, reluctant. "You've proven yourself, Miss Elena. It won't happen again." The subtle dismissal in her tone was still there, but Elena could sense the grudging respect beneath it. Elena didn't respond. She didn't need to. She knew that the professor's acknowledgement or lack thereof no longer mattered. The students in the room would remember this moment. They would remember her. The students' murmurs grew louder, and Elena felt a small, quiet pride settle deep inside her. The battle wasn't just about solving equations. It was about breaking through the walls that had kept her silent for so long. Elena had found her voice, and now no one would forget it. The classroom was still buzzing with the aftershock of Elena's victory. The murmurs of disbelief had faded into quiet admiration, but there was still a palpable tension hanging in the air. Elena sat at her desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her heart still racing from the adrenaline. Her classmates were slowly turning back to their work, their eyes occasionally glancing at her, their respect now undeniable. But no one dared speak too loudly, not after what had just happened. At the front of the room, Professor Dela Cruz stood silently, her back straight, her expression unreadable. She was trying to regain her composure, trying to mask the humiliation she must have felt. Elena could see the subtle tremor in the professor's hands as she wiped them down the front of her blouse. A tiny crack in the armor of the woman who had so confidently dismissed her moments before. After what seemed like an eternity, Dela Cruz finally spoke, her voice sharp, but with an edge of grudging respect. "Well done, Elena," she said, though her words felt almost hollow. There was no warmth in her tone, only the cold, reluctant acknowledgement that Elena had done the impossible. The class watched in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Dela Cruz's words were meant to be a concession, a reluctant nod to the student who had outshone her. But even as she spoke, Elena could sense that the professor's pride was still bruised. It was clear that Dela Cruz wasn't ready to fully accept the shift in the classroom dynamic, but Elena didn't need Dela Cruz's approval. She knew in that moment that her victory had shifted something far more important. The respect she had earned wasn't just from solving the equation. It was from proving that a student like her, who had been overlooked, underestimated and dismissed, had the ability to defy expectations. The class had watched Elena challenge not just a problem on the board, but the very system that had kept her in the background for so long. Dela Cruz's next words came slowly, almost unwillingly. "But this is just the beginning," she added, her eyes still locked on Elena. The challenge was there, hidden beneath the professor's carefully chosen words. A new battle had just begun, but Elena was no longer afraid. Elena's victory wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where she would have to continue proving herself, fighting against the preconceived notions that had been placed upon her. But now Elena knew that she was capable of more than anyone had ever thought. She had cracked the glass ceiling, and there was no going back. Elena's face remained calm, a small flicker of satisfaction hidden beneath her quiet expression. She didn't feel the need to respond to the professor's words. The validation she sought hadn't come from Dela Cruz, but from the realization that she had proven something far more important. She had shown her classmates, and more importantly herself, that she was not the invisible girl who would fade into the background. She was capable, intelligent, and deserving of respect. And from this point forward, no one would be able to ignore her. As the class slowly returned to their work, Elena sat still, her mind racing with the gravity of the moment. She was acutely aware of the shift that had taken place. The power dynamic had changed. Her peers no longer saw her as a quiet, passive student. They had seen her take control, seen her face the professor head-on and emerge victorious. In that instant, Elena had become someone else, someone who no longer needed to shrink in the face of doubt or fear. She had earned her place in this classroom and in the world beyond it. But Elena wasn't done. She wasn't going to let this moment be the peak of her journey. This was only the beginning. As the class continued, Elena sat back in her chair, letting the weight of the moment settle in her chest. There was a quiet sense of triumph in the air, but she didn't need to speak it aloud. Her actions had already done the talking. She had stood up for herself, proven her worth, and in doing so had shown everyone that there was more to her than they had ever imagined. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. She knew that. There would be more moments like this, moments where she would have to face doubts, her own and others. But Elena was no longer afraid. She was ready to take on whatever came next. Elena's face remained calm but resolute. Her journey had just begun, and the world was suddenly full of possibilities. Now, the audience is left to reflect on Elena's journey. The story doesn't end with this moment in the classroom. It's a reminder of the quiet strength that lies within all of us, waiting for the right moment to rise to the surface. What would you do if you were Elena? Would you stay silent in the face of doubt? Or would you stand up, challenge the norms, and prove everyone wrong? The call to action is clear. Elena's story is one of resilience and strength, a testament to the power of finding your voice when the world tries to silence you. What's your story? Do you have the courage to break through the expectations and show the world who you really are? Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Elena's shoes? Would you challenge the system, or would you let the doubts win? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of resilience and triumph. Elena's journey is just the beginning, and who knows, maybe her story will inspire you to take that first step toward your own. The world is waiting for you to rise.